My name is Beau and I am 42 years old. I spent 12 years walking the same delivery route in Tallulah. You cannot even sort letters correctly, Thaddeus said to me beside the oak cabinet in the hall. He liked to remind me of my place before the mailbags ever left the floor. Every morning followed the exact same ledger entry. Rain fell against the glass. The postal scales sat heavy on the wooden counter. They measured out parcels with predictable monotony. I kept my eyes fixed on the delivery route log spread open beneath my calloused fingertips. Every address was recorded with absolute precision. No errors ever slipped past my pen, yet my brother-in-law found a reason to complain over every single bundle that crossed our threshold. "You are simply too slow for this work," he muttered during the winter freeze. I let the insult pass without a word. The kitchen stayed quiet. The coffee grew cold in my cup. I had endured his sharp tongue for 12 long years. Stay for the rest of this story. Subscribe to see what was inside that locked oak cabinet. Most people expect a loud confrontation when families break apart over hidden ledgers, but the truth arrives without noise. This is a quiet reckoning, not a shouting match across the wooden table. Please drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from today. I kept every single daily route log tucked safely under my arm. The mail delivery never stopped for anyone in Tallulah. I walked the same streets every single morning. As a mail carrier in Tallulah, I learned to read the rhythm of a neighborhood. The delivery route log was my primary textbook. Every single porch told a story of arrival or absence. People assume mail delivery is just about dropping paper into metal boxes. It is actually an exercise in tracking deviations. If a stack of circulars sat untouched for 3 days, I always noticed. If a name vanished from a box, I routinely logged it. This habit of careful observation bled into everything else I did. Back at the Landry house, I carried that exact same mental ledger through the front door. The family operated on unspoken rules and quiet hierarchies. Thaddeus moved through the rooms with an air of absolute ownership. My younger sibling, Maeve, tried to stay out of the crossfire. I watched them both with the quiet detachment of a man checking postage stamps. I simply noted who exactly had stopped writing altogether. The Landry household ran on a particular kind of mathematics. It was not the arithmetic of the postal route. It was something older and much sharper. Thaddeus understood it better than anyone else. My older brother, by 3 years, made sure the household operated on a singular premise. What was secured through quiet foresight belonged by public decree to whoever stood up first. They called it taking on a burden. Maeve sat quietly near the corner during those evening meals. At 39, my younger sister had learned long ago that protesting the rule brought heavier duties. She kept her spoon moving in her bowl and stared at the wood grain. Thaddeus carved the roast with steady, deliberate movements. He liked to let the silence stretch before he spoke. Everyone at the table waited for him to claim whatever piece of our collective labor he desired that week. It was a domestic tax levied without legislation. My mother established the principle decades ago, but Thaddeus weaponized it with corporate precision. He treated our family gatherings like an audit where he always held the ledger. The rule governed every transaction under our roof. If someone managed to save a little money from a side job, it was never really theirs to keep. Another family member could simply declare that the funds required administrative stewardship. The transfer was completed immediately. Thaddeus was always the one standing up first. He claimed the burden of management with a solemn nod that fooled nobody. I watched him from my seat near the pantry door. My boots still carried the red clay of Tallulah on the soles. I had spent 42 years watching how people share space. The streets of my route operated on a predictable grid. Deliveries went where they were addressed. Mail arrived in the correct box because postal regulations demanded an objective order. But inside the Landry home, order meant something entirely different. Maeve understood the weight of the system as well as I did. She occasionally glanced across the plates with tired eyes. She never intervened when Thaddeus laid claim to another portion of our shared inheritance. Intervention invited complications that nobody wanted to untangle. The rule protected the person who spoke first. It turned theft into a civic duty within our 4 walls. I kept my pencil in my pocket and my route log closed in my bag by the door. This was not a delivery dispute I could settle with a signature confirmation. It was the fundamental law of the Landry family. a doctrine designed to make robbery look like an act of profound charity. Thaddeus dabbed his lips using a cloth napkin, scanning the space much like a regional boss examining quarterly deficits. He looked entirely comfortable in his authority. He had practiced the performance for as long as I could remember. The table itself was an old piece of oak with scarred edges. Every notch in the grain corresponded to some argument from our childhood. Thaddeus rested his palms flat against the surface and cleared his throat. The signal that a new declaration was coming. The rest of us simply braced ourselves for the decree. It felt completely normal to everyone sitting around the dishes. To Thaddeus, to our relatives who nodded along, and even to Maeve, who had long since surrendered her voice. Only I sat entirely still. I measured the distance between his plate and mine. My delivery route had taught me how to read the small deviations in a neighborhood. This household was shifting too. The pressure was building against the frame of the house. My clipboard was always nearby, and I knew how to tally a column until the final total balanced out. Thaddeus walked into the kitchen with heavy boots clumping loudly. He was 45 years old. He carried an empty leather ledger under his arm, his shoulders squared up against the doorframe. He looked around the room with sharp eyes. Maeve sat near the corner. She kept her gaze fixed on her coffee mug. She was 39 years old and tired. The morning light hit the wooden boards. Thaddeus dropped his papers on the surface. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. He did not look at either of us. The kitchen smelled strongly like stale toast. Thaddeus tapped his fingers against the wood. Some parcels are simply too heavy for the porch, so they never make it past the desk, he said to nobody in particular. He spoke in a low tone. Maeve stiffened beside her mug. She moved her thumb along the rim. Her breath hitched for a brief second. I stood near the counter with my postal bag. My route log was tucked safely inside the leather pouch. I watched the two of them interact. Thaddeus assumed control of every room he entered. Maeve shrank away from his gaze. Over by the far wall sat the heavy old oak cabinet. Its dark wood gleamed under a thin layer of household dust. Inside its lower shelf rested an old child's drawing from decades ago, curling badly at the edges. Nobody opened that wooden door anymore. Thaddeus ignored the furniture completely. He reached for a sharp pencil. He began calculating columns that belonged to nobody else. His pencil scratches filled the quiet room. Maeve looked up for a brief moment. She stared at the grain of the table. Her silence was a habit born from years of avoiding conflict. Thaddeus cleared his throat loudly. He pointed the tip of his yellow pencil at the ledger pages. "We need to review the tallies from last month," he said firmly. Maeve nodded without speaking a word. She offered no resistance to his demands. Her compliance was absolute and quiet. She preferred submission over a shouting match. I kept my posture still. My boots still carried red mud from the morning route. I noted the way Thaddeus positioned himself. He claimed authority through sheer persistence. Every movement was calculated to show dominance. The sun climbed higher outside the tall window. The house felt considerably smaller with Thaddeus present in it. Maeve reached for her mug again. Her fingers trembled slightly against the cold ceramic. She said nothing about the missing entries. She accepted her position as the weaker party at the table. Thaddeus turned another page in his book. He expected total obedience from the household. I watched the scene unfold with professional detachment. Every detail went into my mental log. Nothing escaped my notice. Postal work trains a person to spot anomalies very carefully. A missed box or an unsigned receipt stands out immediately. Inside this house, the anomalies were human ones. Thaddeus ruled through administrative weight. Maeve endured through quiet withdrawal. Neither approach changed the underlying reality of the room. The air grew stale between us. Thaddeus flipped back to the front of his book. He scribbled another note with his pencil. Maeve finally stood up from her wooden chair. She walked out of the room without a backward glance. I remained near the counter for another quiet minute. Thaddeus kept his dark head down over his figures. He did not care about my presence at all. To him, I was just background furniture in his domain. Tallulah outside was waking up for the busy day. Delivery routes required strict timing and exact steps. Domestic routes operated on entirely different rules. I picked up my heavy leather bag. I stepped toward the back door. The cool morning air hit my face. I closed the heavy door softly behind me. The scarred dining table held more than just morning coffee and empty cups. It held the weight of every unrecorded debt my older brother chose to tally in his private ledger. Thaddeus adjusted his collar with a slow and deliberate movement of his thick fingers. He tapped a corner of the paper against the wood to straighten the stack. "You never quite learned how to balance these basic household figures properly," he said without raising his voice above a calm register. Maeve kept her gaze fixed squarely on her porcelain teacup while the morning silence stretched thin around us. She knew the unspoken rule of the room as well as I did. Whoever claimed the burden first owned the outcome under our roof. Thaddeus slid the document across the grain toward my empty coffee mug. I looked down at the neat rows of figures written in his sharp ink. Every line represented months of unpaid labor and quiet concessions disguised as administrative help. "You are simply not equipped for these larger financial responsibilities," he said while leaning back into his wooden chair with heavy satisfaction. I placed my hands flat against the cool surface of the table to steady myself. The kitchen window let in a pale slice of daylight that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. "You know who stopped writing, and you know the exact week the mail went dry." The words formed clearly in my mind but stayed behind my teeth where they belonged. I watched him smooth down another page of the disputed accounts with an irritating sort of practiced patience. "This household requires someone with actual administrative foresight rather than a simple delivery worker," he said while gesturing dismissively toward the front door. Maeve shifted slightly in her seat but offered no defense on my behalf against his calculated pressure. Her silence was a predictable shield designed to keep his demanding attention completely away from her own shoulders. I stood up slowly from the table without touching the paperwork he demanded I sign. The ledger remained open to the page where my labor had been quietly signed away to his name. Thaddeus watched me leave the kitchen with the detached indifference of a landlord inspecting a tenant. My boots made a familiar heavy sound against the floorboards as I walked out toward the hallway. Some parcels are simply too heavy for the porch, so they never make it past the desk. I carried that specific humiliation out the front door and down the steps into the cool morning air. The space between my boots and the baseboard grew wider every morning. I stopped leaving my root log on the kitchen surface. The heavy pine table belonged to other conversations now. I kept my distance without making a sound. Silence functioned as a better tool than any argument. Thaddeus moved through the hall with his usual heavy stride. He acted as though nothing had shifted beneath his feet. Maeve stayed near the stove and stared into her coffee cup. Nobody mentioned the ledger from the night before. That silence settled into the plaster and stayed there. I carried my satchel to the back room instead of the front hall. My boots left no red clay on the clean linoleum near the stove. Every movement became deliberate and small. I started using the oak cabinet by the pantry wall for my personal papers. The wooden doors fitted tightly against the frame without a squeak. I turned the small brass latch with my thumb. Inside that dark wooden enclosure, I deposited my spare pens and small pocket notebooks. A stack of old transit receipts went in next. The oak cabinet smelled of aged varnish and dry cedar. It offered a safe harbor for things that needed hiding from plain view. Thaddeus never looked inside that piece of furniture. He assumed every square inch of the house answered only to his authority. He missed the quiet relocation of my belongings entirely. I placed my spare woolen socks on the bottom shelf behind a row of empty jars. The transition happened without a single raised voice or slammed door. People usually expect a fight when a line gets drawn across a room. Tallulah residents understood the value of a clean break done without witnesses. I walked down the hall and pulled the cabinet door shut. The latch dropped into place with a dull click. That sound belonged to me and to nobody else. My spare flashlight joined the notebooks on the upper shelf. I stored my pocket knife next to the spare stamps. Every item found a specific spot away from the common areas. Thaddeus sat at the head of the table reviewing his papers. He drank his black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He never checked the dark wood of the pantry storage piece. The surface of the oak cabinet stayed polished and bare. Dust motes drifted across the grain in the afternoon light. I stood by the kitchen window watching the delivery truck turn the corner. The mail route called my name long before the sun hit the roof. I slipped my jacket over my shoulders and reached for my keys. My daily routine required no permission from anyone in this building. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the wooden door toward me. The latch caught securely without any noise. The interior of the house remained quiet behind my back. I walked down the gravel path toward the delivery office. Tallulah mornings always smelled of damp pine and engine exhaust. My satchel rested against my hip with familiar weight. I had Tallulah mail to sort and 20 letters to deliver before noon. The porch boards creaked beneath my soles as I hit the final step. I did not look back at the windows of the house. The oak cabinet waited inside with its wooden doors closed tight. My personal items stayed safe behind the brass latch until evening arrived. Every single receipt and notepad rested in the dark timber. Thaddeus could keep his scarred table and his financial papers. I had my own route to walk and my own silence to keep. You are still here with me. That tells me a great deal about your own patience. Have you ever carried burdens for a household that pretended your labor belonged to everyone? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single note you leave. We understand how quiet figures add up over time. A ledger does not forget a missing entry. Before this year ends, those hidden balances will finally clear. Thaddeus thinks his ink is permanent. He will soon discover that paper wears thin. The calendar on the wall changed 3 times. Winter frost settled on the window glass. Thaddeus bought a new ledger with a dark blue cover. He kept it beside the sugar bowl on the pine table. I sat across the room with my own book. The pages inside my book were bound with heavy gray thread. Every morning began with the same quiet routine. I opened the cover and pressed the nib to the paper. A cold wind blew down from the north. It rattled the loose tin on the roof over the pantry. Thaddeus wrote his figures in black ink. He pressed hard enough to tear the cheaper paper. I watched him from my seat near the oak cabinet. My own entries were smaller and much neater. I noted the date and the temperature and the weight of the mailbag. These details formed a private discipline that required no justification. 3 years passed in this quiet manner. Tallulah remained steady under gray skies and heavy rain. The mail route stayed the same length. I walked 12 miles every single day. My boots wore down at the heels. I logged the repair costs in the back of my book. Thaddeus purchased a heavy iron safe for the corner. He carried the brass key on a ring in his pocket. The metal clinked whenever he walked past the stove. Maeve stood at the counter with a ceramic bowl. She peeled 3 apples for the midday pie. Her fingers moved slowly over the red skins. Thaddeus did not look up from his papers. He demanded receipts for every box of flour. Maeve handed them over without a single word of complaint. The house smelled of vinegar and wet wool. I added another line to my column of figures. 14 months went by without a real conversation. The floorboards groaned under our boots. Every season brought its own specific burden of paper. Thaddeus filled 2 entire volumes with his cramped handwriting. He believed the accumulation proved his absolute control. I knew better because I watched the margins. His totals crept upward by $20 each month. The math was consistent. Spring arrived with a sudden flood in the lower yard. Mud rose to the bottom step of the porch. I cleaned my boots with a stiff wire brush before entering the kitchen. Thaddeus complained about the damp air ruining his ink. I said nothing and stored my wet socks in the oak cabinet. The brass latch clicked shut with a sharp sound. Thaddeus ignored the noise entirely. A yellow envelope arrived from the county seat. Thaddeus tucked it into his breast pocket with a thin smile. He thought nobody noticed the return address. My pen moved across the page in a steady line. I recorded the hour and the postmark. Some records stayed empty for months, then a single line filled the space completely. The work continued without interruption. The oil lamp flickered on the side table. Shadows stretched across the scarred pine boards. Thaddeus blew out the flame and went upstairs to bed. I stayed awake in the dim light. My pen hovered over the blank line at the bottom of the page. Every entry served a distinct purpose in the long run. The quiet accumulation of facts required endless patience. Morning came with a hard frost across the grass. Thaddeus walked down the stairs in his heavy woolen socks. He carried his dark blue book under one arm like a merchant. I closed my own volume and slid it into the oak cabinet. The brass latch dropped firmly into place without a single sound. Thaddeus set his heavy ceramic mug down upon the scarred pine table and opened his pages very carefully. Years drifted past in a steady rhythm of ink and paper. The mail carrier uniform grew slightly frayed at the cuffs. I mended the cloth with strong black thread during the long winter evenings. Thaddeus filled 3 more thick volumes with columns of figures and notes. He believed his private system granted him absolute authority over every room. I simply turned the heavy paper page and recorded the exact weight of the morning mailbag without ever looking up once. Maeve placed a bowl of stew in the center of the wooden surface. Steam rose toward the rafters and warmed the damp air. Thaddeus ignored the food while he checked his columns twice. He muttered numbers under his breath like a man whispering prayers. The household operated on rules that nobody dared to question aloud. Maeve sat quietly near the wooden pantry door and watched the cold gray smoke drift slowly outside the window. Summer heat arrived without warning and baked the dirt roads of Tallulah. Dust settled on the windowsill in a fine golden layer. I wiped the glass clean with a damp cloth every single afternoon. Thaddeus kept his windows sealed tight against the humid breeze. He spent hours writing letters to people in the distant county seat. I stored 20 new delivery receipts inside the secure wooden container near the pantry, without making a sound. Autumn brought falling leaves and a sharp drop in the evening temperature. The stove cast a dim orange glow across the floorboards. Thaddeus counted his coins into a small leather pouch. He smiled at the sound of the metal pieces hitting each other. My pen moved across the paper with absolute and unhurried precision. Every single recorded line added quiet weight to an ongoing ledger that required no external defense whatsoever. Another winter settled over the county with heavy blankets of gray snow. The mail route remained unchanged through every freezing storm and slippery street. I stamped 24,000 letters during my years on this specific path. Thaddeus continued his nightly routine at the pine table with his black ink. The old house remained completely silent through the night except for the steady scratch of sharp steel nibs against cheap paper. Time proved to be an efficient clerk that missed no detail. The records grew heavier month by month inside our separate corners. Thaddeus trusted his memory of power while I trusted ink. Nothing was lost and nothing was exaggerated in my bound volumes. The true cost of every single hidden transaction waited very patiently for the proper hour to finally arrive. The kitchen grew darker as the final winter month drew to its close. Thaddeus packed his papers into the heavy iron safe in the corner. I cleaned my nib and laid it carefully across the wooden desk. The long years of quiet observation had built a foundation of solid facts. Nothing more needed to be said while the ledger rested securely under the brass latch. The kitchen air felt heavy. Thaddeus sat at the pine table. He wore his reading glasses. They slipped down the bridge of his nose. He adjusted them with a thick thumb. A stack of green tax forms sat before him. The total penciled at the bottom read $24,000. It was a mismatch. The figures refused to balance. He blinked at the ink. His shoulders slumped forward. He rubbed the bridge of his nose where the wire pinched his skin. For a fleeting moment, the sharp angles of his face softened completely. He looked less like an absolute ruler. He looked like a middle-aged man who had stayed up too late with bad math. He exhaled slowly. A dry rattle escaped his chest. He set his pen down on the wood. It rolled an inch before stopping against a dark coffee stain. He stared at the spot. Maeve stood near the counter. She held a cold mug of chicory. She did not look at her older brother. She stared out the dark window instead. The glass reflected her pale face. The silence in the room stretched thin. Every household had its own accounting. Some items belonged to the front porch. Other items stayed inside the walls. Some parcels are simply too heavy for the porch, so they never make it past the desk, I said quietly from the doorway. Thaddeus flinched at the sound. He did not look up right away. His fingers curled around the edge of the paper. The paper crinkled under his heavy grip. The debt sat between us like an uninvited guest. He knew the numbers were wrong. I knew the numbers were wrong. He picked up the ledger again. His hand shook slightly, just a fraction. It was the only sign of the internal strain. 10 years of root logs sat locked in the oak cabinet behind me. They told a completely different story. They recorded every signature and every delayed delivery across Tallulah. Thaddeus swallowed hard. His throat clicked in the quiet room. The household rules required total submission. Thaddeus had built his authority on precise figures. Now those figures were cracking down the middle. $24,000 vanished into administrative overhead. He could not explain the gap. He looked down at the empty margin. He tried to write a new note. The ink refused to flow smoothly across the page. I stepped closer to the wooden table. My heavy work boots made a faint scuff on the worn floorboards. Thaddeus finally raised his tired eyes. They looked bloodshot and hollow. The morning light was beginning to filter through the kitchen blinds. It cast striped shadows across his wrinkled forehead. He looked old, not angry, just deeply tired. "This column is incorrect," he admitted. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded thin, fragile almost. I did not gloat. I kept my expression neutral. A mail carrier learns to deliver bad news without smiling. You carry what is handed to you, then you hand it back to the rightful owner. Maeve set her mug down on the counter. The ceramic made a sharp clink against the tile. She walked past us toward the hall. She did not offer a defense. The family lie was buckling beneath its own weight. Thaddeus closed the book. The leather cover hit the wood with a dull thud. The kitchen stayed cold. The coffee pot sat empty on the burner. Thaddeus stared at his hands. They were stained with blue ink from years of false accounting. He looked down at the table. He did not say another word. The morning hours ticked past without movement. Outside, the first delivery truck of the morning rattled down the gravel road. The engine noise was a familiar rhythm. I checked my wristwatch. 7 o'clock. The route would start soon. Thaddeus kept staring at the same blank line in the book. He had spent a decade building his kingdom of paper. Now the foundation was shifting beneath his chair. He reached for a handkerchief from his pocket. He wiped his palms. The air smelled of stale coffee and old wool. It was the scent of a house that had stopped breathing fresh air years ago. Thaddeus looked at me across the table. His expression was not defiant. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he had miscalculated his own ledger. He knew the records were incomplete. He knew the receipts existed elsewhere. I turned toward the hallway. My boots felt steady against the floor. The oak cabinet waited by the pantry. Its brass latch held $24,000 worth of truth behind locked glass. Thaddeus stayed seated at the head of the table. He did not try to stop me. The lie had finally grown too heavy to lift. The day was waiting outside. Tallulah would have its letters delivered on time. We are drawing very close to the final ledger balance now. Have you ever watched someone build a quiet world while expecting you to stay entirely invisible? If you watched someone take your daily labor for granted, tell me what you did when the columns stopped matching. Did you keep your mouth firmly shut and let the numbers drift? Or did you start counting every single deviation with absolute precision, waiting for the final page to turn? Drop your honest thoughts down in the comments. The kitchen table held a printed page. Thaddeus had left his phone unlocked beside the ceramic mug. A digital conversation glowed against the dark glass. It was a screenshot of an exchange with an outside lender. He spelled out his entire scheme in plain sentences. He claimed sole authority over every asset in the house. He admitted to rerouting the missing $24,000 into his personal account. The ink on the printed receipt was sharp and clear. This was the written overreach I had waited for. For years, he trusted permanent records to protect his authority. Now his own device betrayed him. The confession sat right there in black and white pixels. No verbal backtracking could erase those transmitted words. Every keystroke was a legal anchor dropping into shallow water. Maeve walked into the quiet room. She paused beside the counter with her empty coffee mug. She looked down at the illuminated screen resting on the scarred wood. "You should not have left that lying out where anyone can see it," she said softly. Her voice carried no anger, only a flat exhaustion. She had watched the slow erosion of our household for over a decade. Thaddeus pushed through the back door moments later. He wiped his boots on the mat before stepping onto the linoleum. He noticed the silence in the room immediately. He stopped walking when he saw his phone on the table. "You have no business looking at my private messages," he said, stepping closer with a heavy stride. His face flushed with sudden defensive heat. I kept my fingers resting flat against the edge of the counter. I spoke in a quiet and steady tone. "Some parcels are simply too heavy for the porch, so they never make it past the desk," I said to him. He stared at me with narrowed eyes. He realized the full extent of his careless error. The written proof could not be unprinted or denied by anyone in this house. The digital trail spanned several months of frantic coordination. He had signed agreements with creditors using our family name without consent. Every message bore his exact digital signature and phone number. The evidence was complete and entirely self-contained. The root log in my oak cabinet paled in comparison to this clear admission. A paper trail was one thing, but a digital confession was permanent. He reached out a trembling hand to grab the device. I placed my palm over the corner of the paper. We stood there in the quiet kitchen without moving. The hum of the refrigerator filled the empty space between us. "You signed your name to an agreement you cannot talk your way out of," I said. He pulled his hand back slowly. The kitchen felt smaller than it had that morning. Years of careful observation narrowed down to this single afternoon. I did not gloat over his exposed miscalculation. Tallulah mornings brought mail to every porch on the route. Here at home, a different kind of delivery had finally arrived. It was addressed directly to the person who thought he owned every room. The balance had shifted without a single raised voice across the entire house. Maeve turned away and walked back toward the darkened hallway. She did not offer to defend his actions or smooth over the details. The silence settled back over the floorboards like heavy dust. Thaddeus stood by the chair and stared at the glowing screen. He knew the record was complete. There was nothing left for him to argue against the facts. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the wooden window frame. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. The house remained still, holding its breath against the coming change. Thaddeus sat down at the table with a heavy sigh. He looked defeated by his own hand. The final accounting had arrived without warning. The morning sunlight reached across the scarred oak surface of the kitchen table. Thaddeus sat in his usual chair. His wire-rimmed glasses rested crookedly on his bridge. I placed the heavy stack of root logs down. Every delivery slip from 12 years of work rested in order. The accumulated record filled the space between us. No single document carried the entire weight alone. Years of missed signatures formed a clear pattern. Thaddeus shifted his weight. He tried to look down at his empty hands instead of the paper. "This table has held our family accounts for decades," he said, trying to steady his voice. I kept my hands still. The $24,000 sat recorded in black ink across 12 separate columns. Maeve walked into the room from the hallway. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was the faded child's drawing from behind the entryway mirror. She walked past Thaddeus without looking at him. She placed the old drawing right beside his ledger. "You always kept track of the wrong things," she said quietly. Thaddeus stared down at the paper. I turned the page of the delivery route log to the spring entries. "You know who stopped writing, and you know the exact week the mail went dry." I spoke without raising my voice above a whisper. Thaddeus adjusted his taped glasses with a trembling finger. His eyes remained fixed upon the ink. The kitchen stayed silent around us. The morning sunlight reached across the scarred oak surface of the kitchen table. Thaddeus sat in his usual chair. His wire-rimmed glasses rested crookedly on his bridge. I placed the heavy stack of root logs down. Every delivery slip from 12 years of work rested in order. The accumulated record filled the space between us. No single document carried the entire weight alone. Years of missed signatures formed a clear pattern. Thaddeus shifted his weight. He tried to look down at his empty hands instead of the paper. "This table has held our family accounts for decades," he said, trying to steady his voice. I kept my hands still. The $24,000 sat recorded in black ink across 12 separate columns. Maeve walked into the room from the hallway. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was the faded child's drawing from behind the entryway mirror. She walked past Thaddeus without looking at him. She placed the old drawing right beside his ledger. "You always kept track of the wrong things," she said quietly. Thaddeus stared down at the paper. I turned the page of the delivery route log to the spring entries. "You know who stopped writing, and you know the exact week the mail went dry." I spoke without raising my voice above a whisper. Thaddeus adjusted his taped glasses with a trembling finger. His gaze remained fixed on the ink. The kitchen stayed silent around us. The brass key remained tucked inside the hallway cabinet. It had secured 12 years of proof against these very ledgers. Thaddeus breathed heavily through his nose. He knew the numbers matched the missing funds. This quiet room was the only witness we needed for the final tally of our shared burdens, he muttered under his breath. Maeve stepped back toward the doorway without a word. She did not attempt to rescue anyone from the wreckage. Her small gesture was finished. She left the child drawing right beside the fraudulent totals. Thaddeus stared at the faded ink with blank eyes. The $24,000 represented every single financial shortcut that he had taken across the difficult course of the decade. I closed the route log with a dull slap. The dust from the road settled on the table. There was no shouting left in this house. The columns spoke for themselves. I stood up slowly and pushed my heavy wooden chair back against the pale yellow plaster wall directly behind me. "You can settle this with the authorities tomorrow morning," I said softly. Thaddeus nodded once. He finally looked up. The kitchen felt lighter now that the records were exposed. The bright morning sun climbed much higher over the quiet Tallulah rooftops that stretched out beyond the old kitchen window pane. 12 years of walking came down to these few pages. I picked up my canvas bag from the floor. My boots stayed stained with red clay. The morning paper remained unread on the counter. The neighborhood routes had already been assigned to another carrier. I had finished my final shift earlier that morning. No further deliveries waited for me on the dock. The house would belong to whoever stepped up to claim it. Our family law left no room for sentiment. Nothing more needed to be spoken between us. The kitchen air tasted sharply like old dust and cold morning coffee. Thaddeus sat slumped in his wooden chair. His fingers trembled against the edge of the scarred table. He waited patiently for the final punishment to fall. I looked down at the heavy canvas bag resting near my boots. The canvas was stained with red clay from the Tallulah roads. Inside sat 12 years of delivery records. Every route log, every receipt, and every single proof of his quiet theft rested inside those pages. I held absolute leverage right there in my open hands. I could have ruined him completely. I could have taken every last cent he possessed, stripped away his standing in the town, and left him with nothing at all. The temptation lingered in the silence for a long moment. It would have been easy to press the advantage until he broke entirely. People in Tallulah love a public spectacle. They love to watch a man who built a wall of rules tumble down into the dirt. I felt the pull of it, sharp and cold against my judgment. I did not hand the records to the authorities that morning. I did not demand public apologies or complete financial ruin. I refused to spend the rest of my days acting as his warden. Revenge is a heavy parcel to carry on any daily route. It wears down the shoulder and spoils the morning hours. I left the papers resting near the center of the table. Thaddeus stared at them with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "You cannot fix a broken house by burning it to the ground," I said quietly to him. Maeve stood near the pantry door watching us. She wore her gray cardigan wrapped tight around her thin shoulders. Her face showed no triumph, only a deep and heavy exhaustion. She knew the exact weight of what we had carried for years. She looked at the stack of root logs, then looked at Thaddeus. "We are done here," she said softly. Her voice carried no malice, only the finality of a slammed door. She did not gloat over his sudden defeat. She simply turned her gaze toward the window. Thaddeus swallowed hard and nodded once. He did not look capable of running anything anymore. His administrative control had vanished into thin air. I picked up my empty canvas bag. My boots felt steady against the floorboards. I turned away from the table without another word. The morning shift was waiting out on the street. Tallulah had porches that needed their mail and houses that needed their letters delivered right on time without delay. The delivery schedule did not pause for family drama. I walked out the back door into the crisp air. The temptation to crush him remained just a shadow behind me. I simply left it behind on the wooden boards. Some battles are not worth the ink required to log them. I walked down the path toward the truck. My route was long, but the sky was clear above the tall trees. The mail had to move, and my work spoke for itself. Restraint was quieter than vengeance and far more permanent. I climbed behind the delivery truck wheel and started the engine. The kitchen felt different today. The air smelled of clean linen and fresh water instead of old paper and stale coffee. After 12 years of watching every movement across the room, I finally sat by the window with my clean clipboard. Maeve stood near the white porcelain counter. She poured hot water carefully into a ceramic mug. The house no longer belonged to ledgers and hidden threats. She handed the cup to me without a single word. It was a simple gesture of ordinary peace. Thaddeus was gone from the front room entirely. He had taken his cardboard box of personal papers and walked out before noon yesterday. The heavy oak table stood completely bare in the center of the room. No green tax forms covered its scarred surface. No forged bank statements waited for my inspection. The wood grain looked dark and worn under the morning light. For the first time since we were young boys growing up here, the entire room breathed without any heavy administrative pressure. It was just a wooden table again. Maeve cleared the last shelf of the wooden pantry. She worked with quiet, steady movements that showed no lingering hesitation. After searching through every forgotten corner of the deep shelves, she picked up a small object from behind the flower bin. It was the faded child drawing we found earlier in the week. She smoothed the creases carefully against her gray apron. She laid it flat in the exact center of the table. The crayon colors were dull with age, yet the clumsy house drawn in blue wax looked surprisingly solid and real to both of us. We kept our daily routines because living required nothing less from us. I laced my work boots tightly by the back door. The red clay from the Tallulah roads dried securely in the treads. My canvas mail bag sat on the floor beside my wooden stool. There were letters for 3 neighbors down the lane. I picked up the bundle and checked the top address. While the morning sun climbed higher into the clear sky outside, I made certain my daily route records were properly sorted and packed. Every delivery slip was accounted for in the pouch. Maeve looked down at the drawing resting between us. She traced the edge of the blue crayon line with her thumb. "We do not need to look backward anymore," she said softly. Her voice carried a steady certainty that had been missing for years. I nodded and slipped my brass pen into my shirt pocket. The front door stood wide open to the sunlit street. As I stepped outside toward the delivery truck waiting at the curb, I felt the familiar weight of the canvas satchel across my shoulder. You remember when the writing finally stopped, and you remember the quiet months after the mail went dry, but the route kept moving forward anyway. I walked out to the metal barrel behind the garage carrying the heavy oak box. The morning air felt sharp against my face. I opened the lid. Years of accumulated slips and extra sheets tumbled into the rusted drum. I struck a single match against my boot. The flame caught the dry paper instantly. Some burdens are simply meant to be burned instead of counted. I watched the black smoke drift away over the Tallulah trees until nothing remained inside the tin except gray ash. Maeve stood by the back porch steps watching the fire die down without saying a word. We left the iron lid open to cool in the morning breeze. The highway outside town stretched out straight and empty under a clear blue sky. I picked up my canvas bag, turned my back on the ashes, and walked toward my truck to finish the morning route.